Another correction that needs to be made to the base of the forward structure is that this bulkhead needs to be extended out to this edge and then bent around to this corner. To extend the bulkhead, I'll be using a piece of styrene stock. The reason why I didn't extend this bulkhead while constructing this part of the superstructure was because I didn't have the correct tools to do the job. The section of styrene that I used to extend this bulkhead is going to need to be cut squarely so that the parts sit correctly once installed. And at the time, I didn't have the tool to be able to make perfectly square cuts. Fortunately, when I was visiting my local hobby shop and speaking to the shopkeepers, they pointed out to me that there is such a tool that would be very useful to me, especially if I'm doing a lot of scratch building. And although I don't do a lot of scratch building, in this model there are a fair number of corrections where having a tool that enables you to cut nice square joints will be very helpful. There are a number of tools like this on the market that would be suitable for this kind of work, and I suppose you could also make your own. From what I've seen, the construction of this one, the chopper, this is actually the chopper 2, is of particularly good quality. It does feel very sturdy. This handle is made out of cast iron along with the base, and there is no play on any of these components. One slight issue that I did find was that the blade was not perfectly in alignment. It was slightly off to the side, but that was very easy to fix. I just inserted a piece of styrene strip between its holder and the blade to use as a shim to just push it into the correct place. After doing that, it is perfectly squared up. Now that you've been introduced to my new toy, I can continue with the extension of this bulkhead. The first thing to do is to figure out how long it should be. To do that, I place an appropriately sized piece of styrene stock on the model in the location of the bulkhead, and then mark the length to which it needs to be cut. When cutting, I do cut it a little bit longer than I need to, just in case I measured incorrectly and I need to trim it back. Obviously, if the piece is too long, you can cut more off very easily. If it's too short, well, then you've effectively wasted the piece. This is my first time actually using this tool, so I'm not entirely sure how it's going to behave. I'm not sure if it'll cut more or less than I expect, so I'm just going to have to see. Anyways, now that it's marked off, I align it with the blade and cut. And there I have my first cut with the chopper. That was certainly a lot easier than cutting it with clippers. Let's see how it fits. Okay, as expected, it's a bit long, but that's intentional. So now I need to chop off a few more millimeters. No need to mark it, I'm just going to do this by trial and error. I'll just place it on the chopper and cut to the next length. I'm using a chopstick to position the plastic on the tool. I am quite wary of the fact that there's a very sharp razor blade hanging above my finger, so I don't quite like the idea of sticking my finger under there in case I move accidentally and, well, cut myself. So I think it's probably a good idea to use something like a chopstick to hold in place these plastic parts while you're cutting them, and then also as a tool to manipulate them and dig them out from underneath the blade, just to prevent the shedding of blood. Okay, let's see how this fits. That looks perfect, actually. I'm very happy with that fit. So now I need to replicate this part. And this is something that the chopper should also make quite easy. So in theory, the way this should work is if I put down the blade and then push up this part right next to the blade, and use this 90-degree angle to clamp it in place, that should allow me to cut another piece of the exact same size. So let's give it a go. Before I attempt to place on the model, let me compare these two pieces. Now, the copy that I've just cut is about 1 millimeter bigger than the original. And I suppose that's because of how the blade is tapered at the edge, and then also how it bends. So it hasn't made a perfect copy. The question is if I push this angled piece right up against the blade, so there is in effect no clearance, and then I try and recut this piece, will that take off just enough to bring it into the right length? Might as well give it a go, see what happens. That seemed to work. It's cut off about 1 millimeter. Let's see if it fits on the model. Yep, that is a perfect fit. Okay, so that's good to know. If I copy a piece using this method, it is going to be a bit long, but I can easily take small chunks off of it by simply aligning that right angle bracket right up against the edge. and it's going to take off roughly a millimeter at a time. Actually, maybe it was less than a millimeter. Maybe it's more like half a millimeter. Anyways, now that I have two sections of styrene that are the same dimensions and have nice right angles, I can glue them in place. To glue them, I use extra thin plastic cement. This is the best glue to use with styrene. It will create the strongest bond. When installing this section of bulkhead, I do try to keep the surfaces as level as possible. I want to do as minimal amount of filling and sanding as possible to conceal this extension under the paint. So far so good. I'm quite happy with these sections. While they are drying, I'll move on to cutting the next two panels that go after these sections. In order to avoid a repeat of the last fiasco that I had with trying to glue down curved strips of styrene, I'm going to try and pre-bend it so that it's supple enough to just easily wrap around the corner. Hopefully by doing this, when I apply the extra thin plastic cement, it won't cause this section to crack and fall apart. I'm also going to be trying a slightly different method of cutting. To that end, I'm not going to freely cut this first section. I'm going to put the 90-degree stopper in place, and then I'll retain the piece that is between the stopper and the blade. I think what happened in the previous occasion was when I made the first cut, the stopper wasn't in place. So as the blade came down and pushed the plastic apart, moved it, and that made the length slightly different when I tried to cut it with the stopper in place, because obviously only one side could move, the other side couldn't move because there was a stopper obstructing its movement. And I think that is why they were slightly different widths. Other than that, the process that I'm going to follow is exactly the same. I take a section that's been prepared with a good right angle on it, I place it on the model, mark off the correct length, and then proceed to cut it. This section appears to be the correct size and shape, so now I need to repeat this cut. This time, the 90-degree stopper is already in the correct place, so I don't need to place this piece between the blade and the stopper to make a copy. I simply need to put a piece of styrene up against the stopper and repeat the cut, and hopefully it is the exact same size as the previous piece. Let's have a look. Yep, exactly the same size. That is definitely the easiest copy of a cut that I have ever made. I've only cut 4 pieces, and I can tell you already this has been worth the money. To glue the styrene bulkhead in place, I apply a drop of Revell Contactor Professional to the top of it to tack it in place, and then I use Tamir extra thin plastic cement along the joint lines to secure it in place to the other extension to the bulkhead. Since these curved styrene strips didn't instantly snap in half when I applied the plastic cement, I can assume that so long as the styrene isn't under stress when you apply the glue, it is safe. Regardless, these parts are still very delicate and they need to dry before they can be handled further. Although this is quick setting glue, I didn't want to take any chances, so I gave it a few hours to dry before I handled it again. Now the glue is dry and I can apply putty to fill the gaps. This is Tamir white putty. I'm applying it to the whole surface just in case it is at a slightly different height. I can then sand it down such that it is level with the existing plastic bulkhead. Also, I'm using this putty to fill the gaps between the sections of styrene and the original plastic bulkhead. Plastic putty is easy to remove, so it's not such a big deal if you do put on too much. You're going to get rid of it very easily. I'm not concerned about making a bit of a mess in this area. After giving the thin layer of putty some time to dry, it can be filed and sanded. I start by filing off the base. The styrene stock that I used was a bit tall, so I need to remove about 1 millimeter from the bottom to bring it in line with the base of this part. To do that, I use a bar file. Once I've leveled off the base, I then move on to filing the sides of the bulkheads. All that I need to do here is to have a smooth finish between the old and the new bulkhead, or rather between the extension of the bulkhead and the original bulkhead. I don't want there to be a visible line between those two panels. This is quite simple to do, however there is a wriggle that is quite close. While I'm filing, I just am careful to avoid it, but then when I move on to the sanding, I cover those wriggles with a piece of masking tape and then use a 400 grit sandpaper that I can quite happily rub over that area with the wriggles being protected by that layer of tape. For the curved section, I use a round file to try and create a rounded surface, and then I fold over the 400 grit sandpaper to create a curved sanding surface, and then further sand it to create a smooth finish. Those curves are very slight. You could probably get away with a straight piece of styrene, but might as well try and make it curved. After all the filing and sanding, I then want to cover this with a layer of Mr. Surfacer. I'm using Mr. Surfacer 500. This will just help conceal any scratches that have been put on by the sandpaper, and maybe if there is a slight line where the joint is, it'll help conceal that as well. Applying the surfacer will also reveal larger defects that it is unable to deal with, and that will give me another opportunity to correct those defects before I paint the part. You can see there are a few defects on this panel, and it's going to require a little bit more filler and a little bit more sanding, but none of that's going to be too difficult to sort out. And after a few more rounds of filling and sanding, this is the end result. Not painted. I'm going to paint everything at a later stage. This is just the finish with surfacer. But as you can see, it is blended in very well. In the next video, I'll be working one level up in this area of the superstructure. There are some bulkheads that need to be removed, and other bulkheads need to be constructed. A few corrections need to be made to that part of the ship. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.